I committed my life to Christ 14 years ago, in spring 2010. And I remember one key question for me in those early days was, why do I exist? The Christians I asked and the books I read had a straightforward answer: to serve and worship God. At the beginning, that answer did not make sense to me. Why would God create me to worship Him? What a bizarre idea, I thought to myself. And I later discovered that a similar answer is given by the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish. There, one reads how the gods created humans literally because they wanted people to serve them. Marduk, the great god in this ancient creation narrative, says the following: "Let me create a primeval man. The work of the gods shall be imposed on him, so that they, the gods, shall be at leisure." So the idea of creating humans in the Enuma Elish is literally to serve the gods so that the gods could rest from their work. Is that what we mean when we say, I exist to serve and worship God? Well, fortunately, the simple answer is not at all. While the scripture response to the question of human existence is indeed to worship God, the biblical concept of worship is very different than the one found in stories like the Enuma Elish. So in this talk, I will offer an exposition of the biblical notion of worship, and especially its relation to justice and holiness, which is often unexplored. And I will do that by focusing on a paradigmatic text from the New Testament, Luke 1:74-75, which is basically 2 verses. This passage, these 2 verses, are taken from the famous song of Zechariah, which Luke records at the beginning of his gospel narrative. In this song, Zechariah celebrates the fact that God has raised up a mighty Savior for us, Jesus Christ, through whom we, being liberated from the hands of our enemies, might worship God without fear in holiness and justice before Him all our days. 3 words are key here: worship, in the Greek latreo, holiness, hosiotes, and justice or righteousness, dikaiosune. Now, standard specialized dictionaries don't tell us much about the meaning of the word worship in this verse, latreo. Deik, for example, which is perhaps the most authoritative New Testament lexicon, defines latreo as, quote, serve in our literature, New Testament and early Christian literature, only of the carrying out of religious duties, especially of a cultic nature. Similarly, Lou Nida, another standard New Testament lexicon, defines latreo as to perform religious rites as part of worship. We sometimes think that if we know the Greek word and grab a specialized lexicon, this will solve our problems. However, this is not how dictionaries work, nor how language works. Lexically, in ancient Greek usage, the word latreo simply means to serve or to worship, and it's used in the New Testament strictly in relation to God or to false idols, that is, in a religious sense. So the question remains open. What does it mean to serve or worship God? The answer to this question lies in the 2 subsequent concepts in Zechariah's song: holiness, hosiotes, and justice, dikaiosune. Zechariah's annunciation is not simply that through Jesus we'll be able to worship God, but that through Jesus we'll be able to worship God in holiness and justice. Now, holiness and justice are 2 big concepts in the ancient world. Greco-Roman philosophers, for example, theorized substantially about them, especially about justice, dikaiosune. Plato's famous Republic had another title in the ancient world, peri dikaiou, on justice. And Aristotle articulated a comprehensive theory of justice. Similarly, the notion of justice and holiness are central to the Old Testament. The Mosaic Law in the Pentateuch is an expression of God's vision for a just and holy living. And the prophets were basically calling Israel back to God's justice and holiness. So in order to unpack the notion of worship in Zechariah's song, what I will do is offer a brief 3-dimensional exposition of the concepts of justice and holiness. First, I will briefly summarize how Greco-Roman philosophers understood these concepts. So this is the first dimension. The second dimension, will be an exposition of the meaning of dikaiosune, of justice, and holiness as they occur together in the Greek Old Testament, particularly in Deuteronomy. And third, I will explain how these two concepts, justice and holiness, are best understood within the narrative of Luke Acts. That's the third dimension. So first, justice and holiness in Greco-Roman philosophy. In Greco-Roman philosophy, hosiotes, holiness, or piety, as it is sometimes translated, and dikaiosune, justice or righteousness, are two important virtues. The famous philosopher Plato, who was widely read by literate people in the 1st century AD, and probably by Luke, theorized considerably about holiness and justice in his famous dialogues. And what is interesting is how Plato understood the relationship between these two virtues. For him, although holiness is a subset of justice, the two virtues are distinct. Plato actually likens the relationship between holiness and justice to the relationship between odd and even numbers. This is how distinct they are for him. In one of his dialogues, the Gorgias, Plato clarifies the distinction between holiness and justice as follows, quote, "Proper behavior toward people is justice, and proper behavior toward the gods is holiness," unquote. So he defines justice and holiness in this straightforward way. Proper behavior toward people is justice, proper behavior toward the gods is holiness. Similarly, for Aristotle, justice, dikaiosune, is social. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he defines justice as follows, quote, "Dikaiosune," he says, "justice alone of the virtues is the good of the others, because it does what is for the advantage of another," end quote. So in a sense, for ancient philosophers, all justice is social. And it's quite interesting that evangelicals are debating whether justice is social or not, with numerous books and articles published, especially in North America, with titles such as "Why Social Justice is Not Biblical Justice," or "Social Justice versus Biblical Justice, an Incompatible Difference," and so forth. Because for the ancients, justice is by definition social. And this is not only the case in Greco-Roman philosophy, but also in the Old Testament. However, the Old Testament goes one step further. And this is maybe where it can get confusing. Unlike Plato, the Old Testament fuses the notions of justice and holiness, and it defines them in relation to the oppressed. And let me expand on this a bit by focusing on a central text in the Pentateuch, Deuteronomy 9 to 11, Deuteronomy chapters 9 to 11. The two Greek words that Luke uses for justice and holiness in the Song of Zechariah, hosiotes and dikaiosune, appear together only twice in the Greek Old Testament. In Deuteronomy 9:5 and in the Wisdom of Solomon, which is a deuterocanonical book, chapter 9. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 5, represents the clearest backdrop for the usage of the words hosiotes and dikaiosune by Luke. And it's important to remember that the book of Deuteronomy is not some marginal book in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy is the heart of the Torah, the heart of the Pentateuch. Actually, the word Torah originally refers to Deuteronomy. And Luke not only quotes from and alludes to Deuteronomy, but the whole narrative of Luke Acts can be seen, as one scholar puts it, a continuation of the Deuteronomist tradition. Now, the book of Deuteronomy consists of sermons that Moses gives on the plains of Moab to prepare Israel for life in the Promised Land. At the heart of these sermons is the law. And what is the law? The law is basically God's conception of justice, fleshed out in a legal code suitable for a particular historical context. The genius of the book of Deuteronomy is not only in this legal code, known as the Deuteronomic Code by scholars, which you will find in chapters 12 to 26, but also in Deuteronomy's summaries of the law. Deuteronomy 9:5, where the two words hosiotes and dikaiosune appear together, is the beginning of a key sermon. which includes perhaps the most beautiful summary of the law in the entire Old Testament. This sermon, which is found in Deuteronomy chapters 9 to 11, could be readily labeled as a sermon on justice and holiness because its primary aim is to teach Israel in a succinct way how to live in justice and holiness in the Promised Land. At the key junction of this sermon, particularly Deuteronomy 10, verse 12, Moses summarizes the whole law as follows. And now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God ask from you? But to fear the Lord your God, to go in all his ways, and to love him, and to worship him, the same word, latreo, and to worship the Lord your God with the whole of your heart and with the whole of your soul. Deuteronomy is very famous for summarizing the whole law in the injunction to love God with the whole heart, soul, and strength, the Shema. But what does it mean? What does that mean? The answer is found in the subsequent verses in Deuteronomy 10, 17 to 19, which says the following. For the Lord your God is God of gods, Lord of lords, the great God, the mighty and fear-inspiring God, who is not partial, neither will he take a bribe, doing justice to the sojourner and orphan and widow, and loving the sojourner to give him food and clothing. You shall also love the sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. So the ideas of loving, serving, and worshiping God is to imitate God. Imitate God in what? In doing justice and extending love to the oppressed and the downtrodden. And in Deuteronomy, we're talking about real, concrete love and justice. In the words of Deuteronomy, to give him food and clothing. Now, I've been using the word justice a lot, so let me clarify. Deuteronomy 9 to 11 is a sermon on justice and holiness. But this sermon, in fact, tackles two kinds of justice. The first is dikaiosune justice, which is sort of the big title of the sermon. And dikaiosune justice is best understood in Deuteronomy as a holistic, all-encompassing vision for righteous living. That's why in English it's sometimes translated as righteousness. This vision includes both relationship with God and all types of social relations, including, for example, the relationship with one's parents. Honor your father and mother. The second type of justice that Moses' sermon narrows down to is krisis justice in Greek, krisis, and in the Hebrew, mishpat. Doing mishpat, doing krisis to the sojourner, orphan, and widow. Now, this word krisis, mishpat, is often translated as judgment, which can be confusing. How can I extend judgment to the oppressed? The idea is quite simple. Krisis, or mishpat, means both judgment or condemnation and vindication or liberation. And these two senses are simply two sides of the same coin. It depends on where you stand. From the side of the oppressor, justice is condemnation. From the side of the oppressed, justice is salvation and liberation. Think Exodus. In justice, God delivered the Hebrews, and in justice, God condemned Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Now, these two concepts of justice, dikaiosune and krisis, should not be seen as separate. Righteousness is not separate from doing justice for the oppressed. On the contrary, Deuteronomy actually fuses these concepts. What is dikaiosune, justice, righteousness, according to Deuteronomy 9 to 11? It is to do krisis, justice, liberative justice, and to extend love, agape, to the downtrodden. This is not only righteousness, but also holiness as well. But the question is, if dikaiosune justice, if righteousness refers to an all-encompassing vision for righteous living, including one's relationship with their parents, why does Deuteronomy 9 to 11 summarize all righteousness by focusing only on the downtrodden and the vulnerable? What about other social relations? I think the answer is intuitive. If one really, really loves the outcasts, those whom people do not want to associate with or look at, surely one can love and honor their own mother and father and behave righteously in all other social relations. Not only that, but there is another fascinating thing in the Greek version of Deuteronomy 10:18-19. God, the text says, does justice to the sojourner, the immigrant, the orphan, and the widow, but loves the sojourner to give him food and clothing. So you also shall love the sojourner. In other words, the sojourner, the migrant, the immigrant, is singled out for God's special love. Why is that? It's because the orphan and widow are vulnerable and oppressed Israelites. But the sojourner, the migrant, is a vulnerable non-Israelite. So the sojourner is the least of the least in that group of vulnerable people. And this is the biblical social ethic. You give more to those who need more. In other words, this is the preferential option for the downtrodden and the marginalized. It's like saying, in the North American context, Black Lives Matter. And in the context of the Middle East, Palestinian lives matter and Gazan lives matter. So in a nutshell, in Deuteronomy 9-11, Moses wants to teach God's people how to live in dikaiosune justice, in righteousness, and in holiness. How to do that? By loving, clinging to, and worshiping God such that God's people behave like God in extending liberative justice and love towards the least of the least. This is the biblical meaning of worship that sits at the heart of the Old Testament. Now let's go back quickly to the New Testament and the Song of Zechariah. Israel, as the New Testament and the book of Deuteronomy itself makes clear, fails to worship God in justice and holiness. The Israelites failed to imitate God in extending love and justice to the oppressed. But is that the end of the story? Did God's purposes fail? Far from it. At the fullness of time, God sends His only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, to fulfill what Israel failed to do. Israel, dear sisters and brothers, is the true Israel. As He Himself declared in John 15, I am the true vine, and the vine is a well-known symbol of Israel. You can read this in Isaiah 5, Jeremiah 2, Hosea 9, Psalm 80, and so forth. Similarly, for Paul, Jesus is the true son of Abraham, Galatians 3:16. You see, Jesus is the dikaios, the just Son of God, who fulfills all dikaiosune, all justice, all righteousness. He is the true Israel, the true liberator of all the oppressed. And now here is the good news. Here is the gospel. Those who believe in Jesus and truly cling to Him are empowered to imitate God in loving and doing justice to the downtrodden and the marginalized. And this is what true worship is about, as the Song of Zechariah declares. Through Jesus, we are able to worship God in justice and holiness. Often when we speak about justice and love, people tell us, these are ideals. No one lives by them. Well, here's the good news for us. Through Jesus, we can do it. We can actually worship God in justice and holiness. This is the Evangelion. This is the good news. Through Jesus, we are liberated, we are forgiven, and we are empowered to be like Jesus in standing with the oppressed and the outcast. And this is what the second volume of Luke's work, the book of Acts, demonstrates. You see, within the narrative of Luke Acts, the Song of Zechariah functions as a prophecy. Actually, some Bible translations, like the NRSV and the ESV, for example, call the Song of Zechariah Zechariah's prophecy rather than Zechariah's song. And the question is, where is this prophecy fulfilled in Luke's narrative? The answer is quite straightforward. Luke depicts this prophecy as fulfilled in the life of the early church. In the early chapters of Acts, we see how sinners, like you and I, are forgiven and empowered through Christ and His Holy Spirit to worship God in justice and holiness. And let me give you just two examples on that. In Acts 2, 42 to 47, Luke narrates how early believers were committed to koinonia, which basically means community. Within this early Christian koinonia, we see the fusion of holy piety and justice in the most wonderful way. Luke describes how earliest believers held everything in common, held everything in koina. That's why it's a koinonia. How they dedicated themselves to prayer, how they practiced need-based distributive justice as opposed to Greco-Roman merit-based distributive justice, and how they celebrated the Lord's Supper. And the fascinating thing is that they did all of this together. We cannot actually distinguish which of these elements are justice and which of these elements are holiness. They are completely fused. Similarly, second example is from Acts 4:32. In Acts 4:32, Luke tells us how early Christians lived as one cardia and psyche, one heart and soul, which is a clear echo of the commandment to love God with one's cardia and psyche, with one's heart and soul. And this is a remarkable use of language by Luke to describe how God is to be loved in community, by living in unity, by centering the poor and the outcast, and redistributing wealth according to need. So to sum up, Luke starts his double-volume work with the good news of the gospel. Although ancient Israel failed, God's purposes will never fail. Through Jesus, Luke tells us, we are able to worship God in holiness and justice. And the book of Acts gives us examples, concrete examples, of how this could be done by living an alternative way of life in which the poor and the outcasts are prioritized. So what does this mean to us today? To be honest, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but let me leave you with one thought. Love and justice, especially towards the oppressed and the downtrodden, are the litmus test of our spirituality and worship. In extending love and liberative justice to those who are stripped of clothing, beaten, and left half dead along the road, we are at the heart of worship. Why? Because in doing so, we are imitating God, which is what worship is about.